We're not in a full-fledged multi-front regional war yet, but we're only 2 steps away. There are 2 wars, close. 3. There are 3. We're very close. We're 2 steps away. I'll tell you what they are. There are 3 big wars going on in the Middle East.
Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and I'm very excited today because I have Hussein Ibish with me, who is the senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute, a weekly columnist for The National, which is a UAE newspaper, and a regular contributor to The Atlantic. Hussein, thanks so much for being here.
Oh, it's so great to be with you, Emily. Thank you.
Very excited. So we are going to be talking about the Middle East and what's been going on, and it's time that Bureaucracy does an update.
Yeah.
So before we begin, what are we drinking?
Oh, okay. Mexican Coca-Cola, no corn syrup, only sugar.
Nice.
I like it.
That sounds good. It's not as good as the old days when I had actual Coke in it.
Yeah,
so.
I cannot drink. No, well, not that old, but I cannot drink. Well, it had Coca. It didn't have, Coke.
Yeah, it Coca.
It had Coca.
But, depends where you bought it.
Yeah. I can't stand American Coke or any Coke with corn syrup. I just don't drink it. And I hate anything diet, I think tastes like cancer. Yeah. So it's Mexican Coke or nothing.
Good for you.
I have Mexican Coke.
I am drinking a beer called, it's from Upward Brewing Company, and it's called Hex. And I feel like that just kind of
there you go.
Feels like how the Middle East is. Just everything's been hexed. So cheers.
Cheers to you.
All right. So before we begin, I'm going to ask you the question I'd like to ask all my listeners.
Yep.
Why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, you shouldn't. You shouldn't trust what anybody has to say. You should go check it out. The historical facts about anything are almost never in dispute. If you rely on reputable sources, reputable news organizations, reputable journalists, and reputable historians, you'll find they don't disagree very much, if at all, on the basic facts. Who said what and did what, when, where is very rarely in dispute among honest people. What's hotly disputed, say between Israeli historians and Arab historians, is why they did it. What was their project? What did they think they were up to? What were they going for? That's, huge dispute, right? That's where the argument is. But the argument among well-informed people who rely on the truth and the verified and verifiable truth, which is in the extremely well-documented historical record about the world since, the mid-19th century and even before in some areas, is not really in dispute. So you have to argue about why people did things. But then you get into kooky land, like Trump won the last election, or just made up lies. So the question is, are you dealing with someone who can cope with the burden of having to admit facts that are not helpful to their arguments, that discomfort them emotionally, that disrupt their narratives? And if you are, then you're dealing with a serious person. And if you're not, you're dealing with a fundamentally unserious person, and you can move right along.
So let's talk about the Middle East. It's been a couple days since October 7th, which is obviously the beginning of the anniversary of when Hamas went into Israel and killed over 1,200 people and took around 250 hostages.
That's right.
Since then, there has been, I think, 42,000 people killed in Gaza.
At a minimum. It became impossible for the Gaza Ministry of Health, which in the past has had a remarkably good record on like the raw statistics. They don't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants, but their basic numbers have always been pretty good, which means it's probably the only Hamas-related organism, because they've run it since 2007 when they forcibly threw out the Fatah and the PA and took over everything. They let them tell the truth, and that's pretty rare. But their numbers have almost always been accurate, but the fact is they haven't been able to count accurately for a long time. So the count sort of reached 41, and then it's crept up to 42, but we really don't know. And could be more. It's more, but could be a lot more, or could be just a little more. We don't know how many people are buried under the rubble.
I just saw an estimate that maybe it was like around an estimate, like a low estimate of 10,000 with
Under the
over,
rubble? Yeah, that sounds about,
that was a
that
low
makes sense.
estimate, I believe, that I
Well,
just
I
saw.
don't know. I mean, it makes sense, though. You would think, because, look, they are only counting corpses. And also, quite a few people died at home and were buried. And if they never made it to a hospital or a morgue, they're not counted. So it's A, the people under the rubble, and B, the people whose relatives just buried them quickly. And in the Islamic tradition, you're supposed to bury somebody within 24 hours. And all you do is you pray over the body, you wash it, you wrap it in white linen and in the ground. That's it. Because the person's gone. There's no fetishizing of the corpse. There's quick, respectful disposal of it. That's it. So it's just hard to know. It's hard to know.
Yeah. The low estimate is 42,000 killed.
Yeah.
I think saw over 100,000 injured. And then now what's going on in Lebanon, which believe the number is it's around over 2,300 killed.
Yeah, that's right.
10,000 injured.
And again, I think you should always assume in a war zone that something like 70% of the people killed in this kind of urban combat are civilians and 30% combatants. That's usually something like the way it plays out anywhere. And actually, it's interesting because the October 7 figures are kind of similar in the sense that it was about 600 were soldiers or somehow military. And then that left about 700 civilians. So it's a very similar breakdown. It always goes like 60-40, 70-30, something like that.
Yeah.
Almost inevitably. Yeah.
No, and I think since also there's been, I think, around 800 soldiers that have been killed.
In the Gaza war, yeah.
Yes, Israeli soldiers. And then I can't remember how many civilians, but it's a much lower number.
It's not a high number. Well, connected to the Gaza war, it's just a few. It's under 10. In the Lebanon war, it's probably still under, well, it depends. If you count the kids in the Golan Height that were killed by the Hezbollah missile that was obviously errant, because there's no skin in it for them to do that deliberately. That was a big screw up. But that's what happens when you play with flying bombs. The number is probably 30. Yeah, civilians. And soldiers, it's much more because since the ground invasion, they've been losing people every day. So today is another 4, and there was 20 the other day. And it's rough. In Lebanon war is not going to be like Hezbollah was thoroughly penetrated by Israel for reasons we can talk about. We know why and how that happened. But it's a much more serious enemy than Hamas. It has conventional qualities. Hamas was a jumped-up militia.
What makes you say that?
Oh, well, because they were able to seize and hold territory in its last 2 wars. In the war against Israel in 2006, Israel thought they were running up against just a militia. But a conventional military can seize and hold territory, as guerrillas don't do that. Militia groups don't do that. So Hezbollah demonstrated the ability to do that against the Israeli forces in Lebanon in 2006. And then they were brought in to the Syrian war when Iran sent Qasem Soleimani, the late and unlamented IRGC Quds Force leader, who was killed towards the end of the Trump administration in a U.S. Reaper drone strike at the Baghdad airport. He and some other Iranian officials went to Russia several times in the summer of 2015 to convince the Russians that they needed a joint intervention urgently to save Bashar Assad from downfall. And they agreed, and they assigned Hezbollah to be the main ground troops that were going to be effective. So it was a joint Hezbollah, Russia, Iran military surge intervention to save Assad. And Hezbollah was the ground forces, and they captured and held territory for Assad, and they were the crack troops. The A team in the Syrian civil war on Assad's side was Hezbollah on the ground, backed up by Russian air power and Russian intelligence. And that actually set up Hezbollah to be penetrated by Israeli intelligence in a way they never had been, because they had to go, because of that assignment, they had to go from being a Lebanese militia that was really served as trainers and advisors, in places like Yemen and Iraq and whatnot. They had to expand their ranks dramatically to play this role as the crack ground forces on, in the war in Syria. That meant taking on a lot of people really quickly. It meant dropping vetting standards. It meant taking on people whose ideological purity was not assured. It's basically taking on a lot of people they otherwise never would have. And that left them open to double agents, people who could be blackmailed, and people who could be bought. And so it's become very obvious that Hezbollah is thoroughly penetrated by Israeli intelligence, to the point that they could intercept the pages, sell them. Actually, Mossad sold Hezbollah the 4,000 pagers that blew up. They
created the shell company.
Yeah, they created a shell company. Yeah. They identified the broker in Hungary, who was a known broker. She didn't know she was selling them Mossad manufactured fake Taiwanese knockoff Japanese pagers with explosives in them. And that's how penetrated they were. And they were also so penetrated that Mossad knew where Nasrallah was when they whacked him, where Fuad Shukr was, where Ibrahim Aqil was, where all these senior people were. They know where they are. You have to contrast that with the fact that they have no idea where Yahya Sinwar is, somewhere.
You don't think they know?
No, they have no. He'd be dead. Of course they don't know. No, they don't know. They did not prepare. So they prepared since 2006 for a war against Hezbollah. Israel knew there was going to be another round. 2006 was a stalemate, and that was not considered okay. And there was a big kind of internal soul-searching in Israel about how did we have a stalemate against this militia group that, yeah, they were effective guerrillas, but like this, they were not supposed to be able to resist.
Can you remind the listeners what happened in 2006?
Yeah. Let's go back to the beginning, right? In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon for the second time. This was a big one, in an effort to drive the PLO northward, very similar to what they're doing with Hezbollah now. And it was supposed to be a limited tactical engagement to do everything Israel is saying now, they said then. And it turned into a giant campaign that led Israel into Beirut. The PLO eventually agreed to go to Tunis. The fighters and leaders went to Tunis, leaving the people in the camps unprotected. Then the Israelis sent this Lebanese Christian militia into the camps, and you had the Sabra and Shatila massacres that were found to be, by the Commission of Inquiry in Israel to be Ariel Sharon, the defense minister, direct responsibility, because he was in total control of the camps during the 12 hours that it was going on. No one was allowed to go in. No one was allowed to get out. And the whole night sky was being lit up the whole time with phosphorescent explosions and things to provide lights for the killing spree. And this was really a revenge attack by several bitter enemies. What happened was it settled into a long-term Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, which was at first greeted warmly by some Shiites, but mainly ambivalence. They were glad to see the back of the Palestinians. They didn't know what to expect from the Israelis. It took weeks for them to turn against the Israelis decisively. And Iran saw an opportunity. The fledgling Islamic Republic was seeking to export Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution, which was supposed to be a big global thing among Muslims. He had dreams of international leadership, and they decided this was a big opportunity among the Shiites in southern Lebanon, and they helped to found and arm and lead Hezbollah and guide it. And Hezbollah then fought an 18-year war to drive the Israelis out of Lebanon. It succeeded in May of 2000. Between 2000 and 2006, the border was pretty quiet. But in 2006, Hezbollah launched an attack on Israeli soldiers that some were killed and some were captured. A few, but still. I mean, we're talking 3 or 4. But still, it is guaranteed to produce a very angry reaction from the Israelis. And there is a war, which was effectively a stalemate, that ended with the Cana massacre, where Jesus supposedly turned water into wine. It was the site of a large UN facility, like shelter for refugees, for people who were seeking refuge from the war. And there was a huge Israeli bomb attack on it, or it was either by mistake or on purpose. It didn't matter, because at that point, the U.S. really said that's the end of that. And the Israelis, having failed to accomplish their goal, just went back. And there was then a kind of an understanding between Hezbollah and Israel about what level of violence on this tense border would be considered routine. That is to say, didn't call for a response or an escalation on the other side. And it was attacks that were about a mile in each direction, 2 kilometers on either side. And we're talking rockets here, or artillery, or what have you. And that were aimed at military targets, and that killed, small number of people. No, you manage to whack 20 soldiers, you're going to have a problem. But if, 2 people get killed in a rocket attack on a military base, well, there's no need for an overreaction on either side. And so it went along until October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel and then demanded that Hezbollah join the war, and claimed that Hezbollah had encouraged them and promised to join the war. The Hezbollah leader went into hiding for 2 weeks because he didn't know what to say. He knew for sure he didn't want to go to war for a place, Gaza, that had no real significance, military, strategic, historic, religious, and no significance to Iran or Hezbollah. And also to save an unreliable ally in Hamas. Hamas does not fit well into the Shiite alliance led by Iran. Hamas is a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood party, and it's a marriage of convenience. There's very little that they share other than Muslim extremism. That's about it. And if you know the Islamic world, that's not a lot, because there are all different shades of Islamic views and different extremist groups, among others. I mean, all kinds of groups, including different extremist groups. And they broke with each other during the Syrian war, when Hezbollah, as I say, was crack troops on behalf of al-Assad, and that was at the behest of Iran, trying to save their friend. And Hamas and its friends in the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood were on the other side. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was one of the key groups at the beginning of the uprising against Assad. So Hamas was sort of told, which was then had its Politburo headquartered in Damascus, was told, choose between your identity and your important strategic alliance. Of course, they chose their identity, and they skedaddled to Qatar, where they remain. Friendly environment compared to anything in the Iranian orbit, directly in the Iranian orbit. So he didn't want to go to war for Gaza or Hamas. So he said, we will. Then he emerged after two weeks. And he said, yes, we're joining this war, of course. But we're doing it to intensify our efforts on the border to liberate these 2 small towns that Israel still held after 2006. That has given Hezbollah its rationalization for maintaining a militia, even though all the Lebanese agreed to disarm back in 1990. And Hezbollah always said, well, we can't because we have to liberate southern Lebanon. But after 2000, that became threadbare because the Israelis had gone. But there were these 2 little towns. So Hezbollah always talked about the little towns, and they said, we'll just, have a war for that. What they wanted was to square the circle. They wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to have, to increase rocket fire on a show of support for Hamas that was limited enough not to create a war with Israel, but enough that they could say, well, we're not doing nothing. So if they'd done absolutely nothing, they would have felt completely pathetic, right? And looked completely pathetic. And Hamas was bitter about this. They made, for about 2 months, they were going around saying they were totally dissatisfied and disappointed. But then they started blowing off saying that because it didn't.
Well, I remember all the documents, especially recently coming out, showing all the minutes from their meetings of them meeting with Hezbollah and Iran, trying to be like, come on.
Everything I've been saying about this, that what I said from the beginning is we knew they had meetings in Beirut last summer. summer, not this last summer, summer before last, summer of 2003. Those meetings, the fact that they had a war room for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iranian officials to meet and strategize was known. It was reported in the Lebanese press. If you read that, which I do, you knew that at the time. What they were talking about, we didn't know. It turns out, I mean, after October 7, it was clear to me what the conversation must have been like. It must have been Hezbollah in Iran hearing something from Hamas about some big action, right? Like that document was talking about.
Right.
And hearing something aspirational and vague. And their reaction is, go for it. Yeah, we'll be with you. Not taking it seriously, really. And Hamas coming away with the idea that, oh, they just promised us support. So I really think it was people talking past each other, which is pretty common in diplomacy. And I think that's why Hamas thought they were totally on board, but Hezbollah and Iran were not prepared for October 7th. They were taken aback by it at the time. I think it's completely obvious by their reactions to it that they weren't expecting anything particular on that day, and they certainly weren't expecting anything on that scale. They didn't get it.
And I think it's pretty evident they were trying to, like you said, keep the peace as much as the peace is between the fighting between Israel's northern border and Hezbollah. You know, like there's like, okay, we'll throw a couple rockets, but we know you're probably going to block them.
They wanted to walk the line. They wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to have a confrontation with Israel, but not an all-out war with Israel. Right. So they wanted to control things. And the Israeli response was, after, taking care of the official formal Hamas battalions by the end of the Rafah campaign, the Israelis were like, that doesn't work for us. And, no, you're not having your cake and eating it too. You wanted a war? Okay, here you go. And Israel established over the course of the past year escalation dominance versus Hezbollah and Iran. And so it was because the Israelis were open to a war with Hezbollah. They could see a lot of benefits from having it. Even the ones who thought it was, too soon and it wasn't a good idea could still see benefits. There was nobody in Israel, in the government anyway, who really thought it was outright bad idea, completely bad idea.
Friendly reminder, the current Israeli government is the furthest right government that they've ever had. It is extremely...
Yes, by miles. By miles. Yeah.
By miles, and extremely nationalist and aggressive.
And it contains within it people who are overtly racist and supremacist. Anyway, the thing is that, they sort of called they called the bluff of Nasrallah and Iran and escalated until the point where we are now, having experienced a series of big successes in the air war and intelligence sabotage war that they had been preparing for since 2006. I penetrated Hezbollah, knew where its leaders were, intercepted its pagers. We're doing great. The war on the ground is a whole other story.
In what way?
Okay. So the war on the ground, no, it's a good question. I think the air war and the sabotage intel war is Israel's war. That's the war Israel was preparing to fight. That's the war Hezbollah doesn't have a good answer for. And it's the war that's gone really well for the Israelis. I think the ground war is Hezbollah's war in the end. I'm not saying they're going to win it or it's going to go great for them, but it's the war they want to fight. It's the war they're ready to fight. In his last sermon, Nasrallah said to Israel, welcome, come in. We think you're planning on coming in. Come on in. The water's fine. People thought he was blustering because he used to bluster a lot. But he wasn't blustering. He was serious because even by that point, it was obvious Hezbollah was going to have to be rebuilt. They'd taken such a battering even before he was killed that they needed to reconstitute themselves or rebuild themselves. And I think what Nasrallah realized is that the best way of doing it, apart from just being left alone to do it, but that wasn't obviously possible. The best way to do it was in the context of a guerrilla campaign to drive Israel out of Lebanon, back to the good old days, back to their founding in 1982, and the war between 1982 and May 2000, their glory days, and leading up to their big victory that was such, that they've been dining out on for 25 years, which is they drove the Israelis out with the guerrilla war that raised the cost to the point that the Israelis just left. And I think the idea of going back to a guerrilla war seems to Hezbollah hardliners to be the best way to get their new recruits trained, because they're getting like Hamas, they're getting a lot of recruits out of the current situation, and get them trained, get them battle hardened, and also to slim down. It sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. They both need to take on new people, but in the way they used to, not for the Syrian war, and in this case, it's not going to be that hard to recruit the kind of people they want, and to train them, to indoctrinate them properly, to do it their way. It's the kind of thing they're good at, right? And I think getting back to basics gives them the opportunity to potentially to become the lean, mean fighting machine that was so effective in 2000, not the bloated mess that emerged out of the Syrian war.
Yeah. I hear your argument, but I would say that the casualties have been kind of vast.
Oh, yes.
I feel like their chance to have that guerrilla war and become successful and show that force has passed.
You may be right. And in fact, there's a real move in Lebanon and within the Shiite community of Lebanon to say to Hezbollah, look, you screwed up again. You did it in 2000. And now you've done it again. You've gotten yourselves and dragged the whole country without consulting anybody else. You've dragged the whole country into a devastating war that you don't control, that the best you can hope for is a stalemate, and it's just not worth it. And plus, there's nothing in the Lebanese national interest at stake here, right? Why would anyone in Lebanon want to have a war with Israel? Well, obviously it's been done because it's in Iran's interests that Hezbollah not back down. I mean, Iran didn't want a war over Gaza or Hamas any more than Hezbollah did, but Hezbollah in supporting Hamas and defending its reputation as a resistance group was doing it because of its connection with Iran. And so it looks to a lot of Lebanese like this is just out of control. That every couple of decades, the country gets into a devastating war with Israel because these guys drag the country into a war. But it's true. They drag the country into pointless wars that are just devastating for other people's interests or for their own interests or for some interest that has nothing to do with the Lebanese interest. And the Lebanese interest is, number one, not having wars with Israel. Number two, not having a militia group with a private army that therefore has a private foreign policy and a private defense policy and can and does drag the country into crazy wars for no decent reason, for at least from the point of view of the country itself. And under such circumstances, the correct thing is for Hezbollah to disarm, for its fighters to be incorporated into the Lebanese army or go home, and for it to become a political party. And that is something that a lot of people are working on doing, but it has to be done in a very gentle way, because if anyone in Lebanon tries to impose things under current circumstances on Hezbollah and its Shiite constituents, they're likely to react hysterically because they're traumatized at the moment. So, and they can easily drag the country back into a civil war. If they, can't prevail in a war with Israel, they sure have the firepower to make things miserable for other Lebanese. So you have to do it gently, and you have to do it discreetly and in stages. And there might be an opportunity for it here as long as it's done delicately, And the first thing to do would be to, working through the speaker, get the parliament, a session in parliament, and elect a president. The parliament elects a president in Lebanon, right? And parliament has not been able to elect a president because Hezbollah has been blocking it, because they want their candidate the younger Sleiman Frangieh to become the president. He's their friend. He's a Maronite Christian. He's their friend. The president is traditionally a Maronite Christian. They're always going to be in Lebanon. But the rest of the Lebanese don't want him. So it's been a stalemate. They won't let anybody else, and no one else will accept their guy.
So is the actual Lebanese government basically, in a way, held hostage by Hezbollah?
Yes.
Who's running the country?
Well, it depends on where you are, right?
Right.
And what
it's like a country within a country is kind of what it seems like.
More than 8. I mean, there are pockets of the country where different groups provide some, exercise some of the role and authority of the state. There is still a state. It's not a failed state. It's a failing state. And that could seem like, a quibble distinction, but it means something. The state exists. It's just very weak. And it has been unable since 1990 and particularly in this century, to impose its will on Hezbollah. But Hezbollah knows something really important. Cheers.
Yeah. Drink break.
Mm-hmm. Which is that every actor in Lebanon's history, beginning in 1943, nominal independence from France, every actor that has sought to dominate Lebanon unilaterally has had the same experience. Everybody else gangs up on them, and they get beaten back to their redoubt. Whether it's the French going back to France, the Syrians pulling back into Syria, the Israelis going back to Israel, or different Lebanese factions getting their butts kicked by everybody and going back to their area and lording it up where they are. And Hezbollah, I think, has been wise in never seeking to impose itself and its ideology on the country, never seeking to dominate the government, always taking part in it, but never trying to run the show. They prefer, rather than controlling the Lebanese government, they prefer tweaking the system when necessary and blowing it off when necessary, and then just pretending to be part of it, pretending to be a normal group otherwise. So I think it's kind of hard to explain to people who don't have experiences with failing states, but the Lebanese state exists in parallel with Hezbollah. Hezbollah dominates only the parts of the state or parts of the state institutions that it thinks it really needs, like the Beirut airport, which it has controlled for a while, and through the administrator. That's how they do it. They put their own guy, they wangled their own guy to be in charge, and they've never let someone else from another group get that administrative position. That's what it means. So after the war in 2006, after Hezbollah dragged the country into war in 2006, and its late leader Nasrallah had to go on TV and apologize, which is something Arab leaders don't do, but he did. And he did it because I think he said, if only I'd known. If only I'd known, I never would have authorized that action. Well, any child knows, that Israel has a doctrine of disproportionality. They overreact as a matter of policy.
Right.
It's a survival strategy.
And it's only gotten grander.
It predates the state, in fact, and the state of Israel, I mean. And this doctrine of disproportionality was unlikely to be suspended for Hezbollah, So, I mean, it was a kind of apology that's meant to be offered and accepted, but not believed. And the other thing is, I would say that a politician is revealing a remarkable degree of political crisis when they plead stupidity to indemnify themselves against charges of grotesque mismanagement, which is exactly what he was doing. He was saying, I'm so dumb. I don't know what every fool knows, but believe me, if I did, I would have been. He wanted to get out of the what did you do? Why would you do that? And he's like, well, I didn't know. Everyone's like, oh, you didn't know.
Now, since Nasrallah is gone, which was
he's dead.
Huge kill.
Yeah, it
by
was
Israel.
well, very big. Yeah, they tried to kill him twice during the 2006 war, narrowly missed him, but they didn't have the penetration they had now.
Right. And I mean, it was a massive escalation as well as with the pager explosion. I mean,
Yes.
there's massive escalation, right?
Yep.
What happens? And now it's in war, right? And I
Yep.
like how people are like, we're not headed towards a full Middle East war. And I was like, we're in a war.
We're
It's
two.
past.
Okay. So there are two
That's
wars.
my opinion.
Well,
Anyways.
okay, you're right. There are two. Well, we're not in a full-fledged multi-front regional war yet, but we're only 2 steps away. There are two
feels pretty
wars.
close.
Three. There are 3. We're very close. We're 2 steps away. I'll tell you what they are. There are 3 big wars going on in the Middle East. One in Sudan that nobody talks about. It's a very big war. It's a terrible war. That's going on. Then there's a war in Gaza, which has become an insurgency, counterinsurgency, which is the war Hamas wanted. And they finally got that because under Netanyahu, Israel won't leave. Then that's exactly what Hamas was counting on, and they're getting it.
Why?
Well, because their whole purpose. Oh gosh, this is a very long explanation, but I'll give it to you. But let me complete the thought.
Finish your first thought, and then we'll go back to it.
The third war is in Lebanon. And the Lebanese and Gaza war are parallel wars, but they're not the same war. I mean, I think it sounds great for Benny Gantz to write this propaganda thing in the New York Times. It was just gibberish from an analytical point of view. It was nonsense. It was pretty good propaganda, but it was gibberish. They are not the same war. Hamas did not act pursuant to Iranian instructions. Hezbollah does. Hamas is in a marriage of convenience with Iran and Hezbollah. It is not a creature of Iran. And the wars are not the same. And there is no off-ramp in Gaza. That war is not ending anytime soon. There is an obvious off-ramp in Lebanon, if people want to take it. There is the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which calls on, among many other things, Hezbollah to withdraw to above the Litani River, which would put it about 20 km, between 22 and 25 kilometers into Lebanon, away from the Israeli border. Lebanon agreed to this. The government of Lebanon, Hezbollah didn't, and Hezbollah blew it off. Israel has its own responsibilities, which it also blew off, about airspace and things like that. But the point is, it can be implemented. Hezbollah, one of the reasons so many Lebanese are so pissed off at Hezbollah, and rightly so, and I can be added to that list, is that for the past year, Israel has been saying, withdraw your heavy equipment and fighters to the Litani River. And Hezbollah was like, no, we don't want to do that. The reason they don't want to do it is precisely because, as I said before, since 2006, they've been saying, since 2000, actually, they've been saying we have to keep our private militia to protect the border and to liberate these 2 little towns. Well, if you agree to go 20 kilometers and never come closer, how can you protect the border and liberate those towns from 20 kilometers away? Obviously, you can't. So the question would come up sooner rather than later. Now, what about this army of yours? Come up with another excuse, because we'd like to hear it. I can't imagine what it would be. And, people kind of think, well, why would they care? Well, no, they're willing to throw their weight around, but they have to pretend, because of what I said before about dominating the whole country and then getting your butt kicked. They feel the need, rightly, feel that it is much wiser for them to pretend to be part of the system and to pretend to do everything according to the Lebanese national interest, and to wrap themselves in the cedar flag, which they do all the time, and say everything is for the country, even if when it isn't, because it never is, really. But that's why they didn't take this deal. Now, as soon as they, as of maybe a month and a half ago, when things started going after the pagers, exactly after the pagers, they sent the acting Prime Minister Mikati and the Speaker of Parliament Berri to offer to the Americans, and therefore to the Israelis, that they would implement 1701. Well, why didn't you say that before? Now Israel isn't interested in a compromise. Now Israel is no longer interested.
Let me clarify that.
Yeah.
Hezbollah agreed to 1701 to move 20 kilometers
They
away.
never agreed. Oh, they've agreed to it now after the pagers went
After
off.
the pager attack. They agreed after the pager attack.
Yes. But by that point, they were...
Israel was like, we're done. We're fighting.
It was reported, but maybe not appreciated fully for what it meant. Because what it means is that two things. Number one, that Hezbollah backed down completely, was willing to back down completely. But now Israel wasn't interested in what it had been demanding before. Now they want more because it's a matter of like their horizon shifted because of the success. And also it means that, of course, that Hezbollah could have had that deal before and didn't take it. Right. And so like, it's such an incredible missed opportunity for everybody. But the reason they didn't take it, it has to do with the excuse for having a private army. They would lose that excuse. And now at this point, they're so battered that they're no longer concerned about that. And with Israeli forces inside Lebanon, it's sort of moot. As long as they're there, Hezbollah doesn't need an excuse. That excuse is there. Just self-defining, unfortunately. So anyway, I can tell you about Hamas and why it wants the insurgency against Israel, if you like.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Because that's what we abandoned before. We can come back to it.
Let's come back to it.
All right. So my belief, and every piece of information that has come out since October 7 has validated this belief and reconfirmed it, including those documents, but other information as well. And I wrote about this, going back to October 12th in The Atlantic. I had a piece called Israel's Walking into a Trap. And October 12th of 2003, I might add, not this October 12th, October 12th of last year. My point was that Hamas launched the October 7 attack as part of an ongoing bid, which is their prime directive since they were founded in 1987, which has almost nothing to do with Israel, in which Israel is the means to an end, but not the end itself, and in which is all about domestic political power among Palestinians. In other words, go back to basics. Why do people found political parties? To get power. No matter what their other agenda is, they need power to implement it. Right wing, left wing, libertarian, socialist, anything, Islamic, Jewish, whatever it might be. If you don't have power, if you make a party to do something, you must get power to do it. And you must get domestic power first. You must rule your party, right? The Trumpian wing of the Republican Party had to defeat the traditional Republicans. The left wing of the Democratic Party, the progressive left, must get rid of the Biden, Harris, Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries centrists. So they have to tread carefully, but that's really their goal, is to take over first, and then you get to your external opponents. Hamas was founded in 1987 when the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza saw an opening. The PLO had been driven out of Lebanon into Tunis, as I said, in 1982. And there was a spontaneous eruption of rebellion, mostly nonviolent, some rock throwing, nothing mechanized, nothing with guns, against Israeli occupation. It began in Gaza, but it spread all over the occupied territories. And it was run by local ad hoc committees. Gramscian committees, just ad hoc stuff, because the PLO was far away, and the PLO made a big effort to try to get back in on the ground, and they eventually did towards the end of the first Intifada. Drink break. Intifada means uprising in Arabic, or shaking off, but uprising is the right translation. The Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza saw an opportunity, saw a vacuum, that these local committees were not really a political movement, and that the PLO was not around. So they founded a party that was also going to be a paramilitary, or have a paramilitary in it. was Hamas and the Qassam brigades of the paramilitary. And the purpose of it was to take over the Palestinian national movement and turn it from a secular nationalist movement led by Fatah and the PLO into an Islamist movement led by them. And that was the prime directive when it was founded. And that goal is not complete. It's not even close to complete. It's still not close to complete. It is still Fatah that controls the PLO entirely. Hamas has absolutely no part in the PLO. The PLO is the sole diplomatic representative of the Palestinian people, according to every document that exists. The UN, Arab League, Palestinian, Israeli, anything. It's the PLO. And Hamas doesn't challenge that, actually, because they understand that the diplomatic standing, the global standing of the PLO, is the biggest single asset the Palestinian national movement has acquired since its reconstitution in 1967, after the 67 war, the disaster for the Arab states against Israel. The Palestinians reconstituted. The PLO was founded in 64 as this sort of puppet wing of the Egyptian government. But Yasser Arafat, George Habash, and others established, reconstituted the PLO in 67 as an independent Palestinian movement. And it became the central body of the Palestinian national movement for a long time. But it was entirely secular. And if you look at the PLO charter, it doesn't say anything at all about Islam, doesn't say anything about Christianity. And the only thing he says about Judaism is that Jews are a religious group and not a national group. So it's to kind of challenge the premise of Zionism. It's a silly statement, but that's the only thing they have to say about Judaism. In contrast, the Hamas charter is full of anti-Semitism. It's full of crazy talk. It's full of wild Islamica and bizarre stuff. So my point is, there was this sense that there was a vacuum. They sought to fill it. They did fill it. And as long as Fatah dominates the PLO, and the PLO has this role as the diplomatic representative of the Palestinians, every time a Palestinian gets up to talk at the UN, at all the multilateral agencies they belong to, at the ICJ and the ICC, I'll come back to that in a second, at the Arab League, at 130 embassies, it's a Fatah voice speaking. It's a non-Hamas and anti-Hamas voice that is speaking. And this is something they have to deal with. And I'll tell you how valuable the PLO's status as a non-member observer state in the General Assembly is. It gave the PLO, or the state of Palestine, as it legally is in the UN, the legal authority to accede to the treaties that govern the International Court of Justice that rules over states and the International Criminal Court that holds individuals responsible. That gave the ICJ the standing to hear South Africa's complaint against Israel for genocide in the Gaza war. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any standing, because Gaza is considered an inevitable part of the putative state of Palestine. Right? So that the state of Palestine, being a member state of the treaty that governs the ICJ, it gives the ICJ standing for what happens in Gaza or happens coming out of Gaza, so that they can also hold Hamas responsible, which they want to. And the ICC wanting to indict Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders, the ICC similarly, the state of Palestine's participation in the separate treaty that governs the work of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, gives this guy, Prosecutor Khan, the ability to ask for the indictment of people like Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, and Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, Ismail Haniyeh, and other Hamas leaders for October 7. And so this status is invaluable to Palestinians, and Hamas doesn't want to give it away. They want to take it over. And they thought that Gaza had turned into a trap for them. They thought that initially that governing Gaza would be a platform to get back into the West Bank and to proceed in their mission of marginalizing Fatah and taking over the Palestinian national movement. And that wasn't happening. They got trapped. They had all kinds of woes and all kinds of problems, and extremists had taken over the movement. The gunmen who fought the wars against Israel had taken over, and the old political leaders were there in Qatar in hotels. Sinwar calls them the hotel guys, because they live in hotels, and he lives in like a cave or something, and total contempt for these people who were pushed out of power in Hamas and became the diplomats. Like Haniyeh was not the leader of Hamas when he was killed, titular leader, but in fact he was the head diplomat. He was there to go on TV, make speeches, and get money. They were not taking any orders from him at all. And these guys concluded that ruling Gaza was a trap, that it was a waste of time, that they were not getting anywhere. So what they decided to do was overturn the apple cart, attack Israel, drag it into what they later said they wanted was a permanent state of war with Israel. Well, what could that mean? It could only be an insurgency in Gaza, right? They knew, in other words, that they were throwing away everything they had built since 2007 and offering up a human sacrifice of the people of Gaza to whatever war was going to take place, in an effort to create a long-term insurgency against Israeli troops who would be lured back on the ground in Gaza to stay, which is happening, and that will provide them with a bloodied shirt that they can wave every day, or at least every week, and say to the Palestinian people, we're the national leadership because we're the ones who are fighting and dying for control of Palestinian land here in Gaza every day. In the West Bank, they don't do anything. They're the gendarmeries of the occupation by keeping the peace. And the PLO sits at an empty negotiating table waiting for Israelis who never come, and bad things happen when they do. So we are the national leaders. And that I think it's intended to be the next phase of their campaign to take over the Palestinian national movement. That's why I call Israel, at this point, for Hamas, means to an end rather than the end. Now, once they did that, they would then have to decide whether they want a state alongside Israel, or if that's still possible, or whether they still want to try to, reverse 1948 and
it was like, but there's not
Israel.
A world in which Israel ever sits
Agreed.
at a table with Hamas.
No, I agree with you. I wrote that in my last piece for The Atlantic, that Hamas is kidding itself because they don't appreciate how radioactive they've become globally because of October 7th. If they did take over the PLO would lose its standing globally. They have, this is a big miscalculation. I mean, the title of my article was Israel and Hamas are kidding themselves. I think both sides think they're winning. Both sides think they're doing great. And I think both sides are getting themselves into a hell of a situation.
Yeah. No, and the real cost is the innocent human lives.
Yeah, of course. Well, there's that too. I mean, that's just beyond anything. I'm trying to do a kind of a dispassionate evaluation of the motivation of the players and how well they think they're doing by their own terms. All of this comes at a hideous cost to individuals. And, Hamas was willing, as I say, to put everyone in Gaza at risk of obliteration and displacement and what have you. And the Israeli response to October 7 has been a savage war of vengeance that has looked really genocidal on many occasions, and certainly when it comes to the use of starvation as a tool of war.
Especially what's happening in the north right now.
Yeah,
Israel just blocked
exactly.
it all off again. Yeah.
It's looking more and more like that. It's becoming harder and harder to say that that's hyperbolic. On the other hand, it's certainly a war of vengeance. Netanyahu on October 7th said there will be a mighty vengeance. And he's been quoted several times as saying the people want revenge. And he's giving them that. And that's the one thing that has definitely been accomplished. There's been plenty of revenge.
Yeah. No, this is all very interesting. I mean.
Oh, good.
No, absolutely. No, I find this is, a lot of what people see is on social media, and you see just the innocent human lives lost, right? And a majority of that at the moment is
awful.
People. It's horrendous. And people in Gaza, just a couple of days ago, photos and videos of people being burned alive. Right?
Yeah, I saw the people burning was just so
horrendous.
Bad.
Absolutely
so
horrendous. Any life lost, any innocent life lost is absolutely horrendous, right?
You have to begin looking at this whole topic with, you won't get anywhere unless you make several core assumptions or a priori understandings. Number one, all human lives are valuable, and they're all equally valuable. Number two, everyone has a right to be where they are and where they're born and what have you. And there's no narrative that disenfranchises somebody from their country. And if they're born in a place, it's their country. And even if they've emigrated there, it's their country now. So, I mean, this disenfranchising the other and expelling them, even in theory, is just unacceptable. And the last thing is that that there must be that the only way for this conflict to end is for two peoples to have means of expressing their self-determination and having full, citizenship. I mean, in the case of Palestinians, full citizenship at all, because they don't mostly have it. And in the case of Israelis, to retain their full citizenship and all their rights. And anything else is going to sentence them to continued warfare.
Absolutely. But it's interesting because what you see is the immediate, right, kind of the micro of the whole situation. You see just the immediate killing, you see the immediate aftermath. But this conversation really provides the macro big players of how this has led to this situation, and then what the players are thinking and what it leads, you can assume their end game is trying to be.
When it comes to the consumers of the snippets and footage, pictures, actualities on social media, what it ends up with is usually reinforcing people's biases and presumed understandings. So that if they fundamentally think Palestinians are in the right, they will find that reinforced. If they fundamentally think the Israelis are in the right, they'll find that fundamentally reinforced, because the algorithms curate your experience for you and reinforce your points of view. And people in moments of high stress, anxiety, fear, etc., they don't want the truth. They don't want the facts. They don't want they don't want to think. They want to be comforted. They want a warm narrative that they can wrap around themselves that'll make them feel better, because they can barely cope with how they're feeling. But that alienates them from the fundamental realities, the underlying realities, which are very messy, not all that complicated, but are morally complicated, and in which there are no clean hands, and there's no goodie and no baddie, and everyone you're just looking at two sets of human beings. Let me put it like this. The great irony of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not only that it's a very young conflict relatively, and that these identity groups didn't exist 100 years ago. They're Palestinians, but we're not Palestinians, and there was no such thing as Israelis. So, look, this is new. But more importantly, these are two groups of people doing people things. They're behaving like human beings behave. Neither Israelis nor Palestinians have at any point in their histories not reacted to realities the way people normally do. And that's the problem, is that they're behaving the way people tend to act. And then they see each other and they think that the other side are like the worst people in the world.
And you can't blame them for that.
Well, they're just like you. It's not like you're going to behave any better if you were in their situation. You wouldn't.
No, absolutely. There's just so much anger.
Yes, but the anger often comes from seeing an unjustifiable action and blaming it on the ontological character, the essential identity, the fundamental badness of the other side, or some people on the other side, when in fact they may be bad, but they are also human, all too human. They're not different than the other side is. And there's no clean hands. There are no good guys. There are no bad guys. There's no way of undoing this knot in a straightforward way, because you don't have here an oppressed people versus an oppressive government. You have two societies that are at loggerheads on everything. The fact that one has all the power and the other doesn't have any power doesn't mean that the people on either side are fundamentally bad, or that they even fundamentally hate each other. They're just vying for land and power in the same very limited space. Both of them see the other as, as somehow unworthy newcomers, outsiders, that this somehow belongs to them for whatever reason, history, religion, what have you. And the idea of sharing only appeals to one side or the other when they feel they're in the minority or they don't have enough power or what have you. So the idea of a democratic one-state entity was kind of popular among Jews in the 20s and early 30s, when the Jews had very little power in Palestine, and it wasn't clear at all that they would have the ability to create a Jewish-dominated state. And it resurfaced mainly outside of Palestine among Palestinian activists in academia in the West, and other activists in the West. A lot of them are Palestinians, but all of them pro-Palestinian. In the aftermath of the failure of the Camp David talks and the Second Intifada, when everyone got radicalized, and they couldn't really become Islamists because they're mostly leftists and they don't go there, but they may be sympathetic to Hamas in a way, but they're not Islamists. They be one-staters, and it's interesting because it invariably appeals to people who think they're losing. When they think they're winning, they're not interested.
It's an interesting take. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm very grateful to have you to be discussing this and providing your input and your insight.
You're very welcome. I'll come back anytime. We
could talk for hours.
Yes, we could, and we could talk about something else too. So it's up to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. For
anytime.
For the list. I mean, listen, I could listen to this for like 4 hours and not get bored.
Wouldn't bother me to talk for 4 hours either.
Right. But for the benefit of the listeners, I do feel like we should probably wrap it up. But any last comments or thoughts that you really want to hone in on?
I mean, it's kind of hard to know where to go with that. I mean, the only thing I would say is there are lots of conflicts in human history that don't get resolved. They never get resolved. There's not a clear-cut victory on either side because one isn't available. And neither side wins and neither side gives up. And it just keeps going until something happens, which is the context in which that conflict emerged fundamentally changes. This might be one of those conflicts. And you might just limp along until the people in the Middle East no longer live in discrete Westphalian states and start forming themselves into regional blocks where these discrete countries with strict borders and identities, it no longer works for economic reasons or whatever kind of reasons. Eventually, though, I'm sure that will happen. I mean, we're not going to live in discrete nations forever. This is a very specific construct of the past few hundred years. Hasn't always been like this, won't always be like that. The rate of change is accelerating. So that could happen sooner than people think. And also, whether that's the change that breaks the logjam or something else happens that changes the fundamental context, that may be what's required. But when change comes, it happens like that. Political change in static situations is a bit like evolution, biological evolution. Things go along the same, and then all of a sudden they start changing, and then they go back to the same. It's not a linear up and down. It's not a predictable wave. It's those spurts of change that happen when change is necessary, when evolution requires natural selection to kick in and save a species, create a new species, whatever it is. Political change is like that, in my lifetime. I grew up in the Cold War. And then one morning there was no more Soviet Union. I mean, it did not happen overnight, but it was awful close. It was really a matter of oh, here's the big bad Soviet Union. Oh, I know, it's gone. Then the United States was the world's sole superpower. We don't talk like that anymore. It's still the most dominant, it's the only real global power. But we no longer think in monopolar terms because we don't live in a monopolar reality anymore. So that means in my little lifetime, we've been from a bipolar world to a monopolar world to a multipolar world. Not just in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime, that too. Not just my lifetime, in my adult lifetime. So things can change pretty dramatically, pretty fast. This conflict survived all that change. Yeah, sure. Because it's a little island of its own. It didn't respond to any of those things. It was not at stake. But what I'm getting at here is that change can be very sudden and very surprising, and it's hard to predict. So those who lose hope for change may be forgetting the radical contingency of political transformation and how quickly things can happen.
Absolutely. And this feels like a watershed moment.
It is.
Yeah. Well, Hussein, it has been great having you. Thank you so
Emily.
much for providing your insight.
You're welcome.
And your analysis. It's definitely given us a lot to think about.
Anytime.
And really appreciate it. So I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.